I think we should make a start. So, okay. So it is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Ira Gang. Ira is a good friend of ours for many years now, in some cases, many more years. And he has published papers on a number of topics in economics, development, public choice, public policy, political economy, and of course, migration. So today he's going to tell us all about migration and education in Central Asia. In the usual way, just a couple of things. One is that the seminar is being recorded and it will be available on the GLO website by early next week at the latest. And also in terms of the questions, please write your questions using the chat function, or if you want to speak, just say that you have a question, and when the time comes, Ira will take questions as he goes along, every 10, 15 or so minutes, depending on the questions. And he has a group of people to answer, or his co-authors that are there to answer. So they can look at the chat, because I think, Ira, you said you were struggling to find the chat. I know you found eventually, but if there are any chat questions and Gil or Ilham want to take or want to answer, then please go ahead. And then just to kind of final, if you have not muted yourself yet, then please press mute so that there's no kind of external noise. So floor is yours, Ira, for an hour, and depending on how it goes, if there are too many questions, then we'll go the full hour. If there are not enough, then it maybe last 5-10 minutes to answer any remaining questions. So to you now.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, everyone. Familiar faces, names. This is a joint work with Ilham Abdulov and Gil Epstein, both of whom are here, and both of whom should feel free to answer any questions in the chat, since they're here and need something to do. Okay, so we've been working for a while now and have a series of papers on a number of topics related to particularly Tajikistan. But today I'm going to draw on 3 of our papers, 2 by the 3 of us and 1 by the third. One on Central Asia, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, by all 3 of us. One that's GLO working paper is 641. Another that Ilham has written, which brings a lot of some of the issues that we'll talk about more up to date. And I'll refer to another one that's the theory paper that should be a GLO working paper soon, as soon as we reread it, check it out. Okay, so what we do here is we're interested in the effect of migration on educational attainment in the migrants' home country, the countries of origin. Essentially, our story is that post-Soviet educational attainment is affected by the option of migration. And we want to see how that option affects the educational attainment. And one of the ideas that comes out is that opportunities abroad, rather than really having a positive demonstration effect, that is, opportunities abroad lead to increased education and human capital in the home country, as has been at least the leaning of the literature in the last 20 years. It seems, and we're picking up on a number of themes that other people have put out also, it seems that often people get less education because of this opportunity to emigrate. So some of the literature, the classic literature about the effects of emigration on a home educational attainment comes from the trade literature, Bagwadi and Hamada on the brain drain. The return to education is higher at the destination than at home. home. And so what happens is you have highly educated immigrants. They leave the whole country with less educated individuals. This is a high cost to the country that provided the education of the immigrants, the home country. And Baghdadi at one point proposed a tax on immigrants that would reimburse the country for its losses. And this idea has been around probably even before 1974, and it's not uncontroversial. And various times people have raised conceptual and empirical issues with it, at least with it as a as the law or the truth. So, for example, Chikara and Hansen find that migration to the U.S. provides an incentive for Mexicans to not invest in education. It lowers their incentive. And Stock and Byra, in a theoretical treatment, talk about a backdoor brain drain in which the immigration of low-skilled workers essentially leads to less education in the home country because they don't need it. They can plan on emigrating. Now, our theory model comes to the same conclusion from a different origin as theirs, and then we do the empirical work, which is what I'm going to present here. The brain gain, right? What are the three main areas of the brain gain, which have been talked about more or less for the last 20 years, are immigration brings remittances, immigration brings some return migration with its new foreign experience, skills, training networks, and as well as the demonstration effect that, oh, gee, the immigrants have been generally higher educated, so I should get an education, my kids should get an education so they can take advantage and also immigrate, and only a small fraction of them emigrate. So the country gains an increased human capital. The findings on this have been not so strong. Sometimes you find it. Usually the effect is very weak. Going back to discussions by Riccardo Faini in 2005, 2006, 2007. He had some papers on it. Okay, so what is our story? Our story is that there are international wage differentials for low-skilled labor, essentially, but for all labor. And we take these international wage differentials as exogenous, and that immigrants may forego higher education, tertiary education in the Central Asian terminology, professional continued education. In other words, post-mandatory education. It took me a while to learn this terminology because of professional, because it clearly has different connotations in different places, but I'll show you a diagram later in a little bit. And okay, so this difference in the story is what? That this difference in wages and incomes leads to rejection of professional education and training by individuals in the origin country in the expectation of migrating. For those who haven't gone yet, there may even be a discouraged worker effect in the home country, even in terms of labor markets. Ilham has done some work on that. And what we're saying is that as a general phenomenon, this rejection of higher education in terms of in hopes of emigrating, it can bring about this forsaken schooling phenomenon in migration, basically a decrease of human capital. In a sense, there's this concept of brain waste in a paper that I always liked by Weiss, Sauer, and Gotoblowski where they talk about the sort of loss of years of schooling for the immigrants when they change economies. And I sort of think of what we're finding as a sort of brain waste as a result of immigration, but now in the home country. I don't know. Kind of like the term too. All right. So background, just in case, if I won't make any comments about U.S. audiences. Okay. So here's Russia. That's where they're going. I actually notice how old this map is, right? Because here's Crimea, right? Maybe it's, well, whatever. Okay. And then here's Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan. So this is the main route of migration. More recently, some people have gone to Kazakhstan, but these are the three main emigrating countries of Central Asia. Here, our original data was 2007, 9, and 11. So this particular graph was really great because what you can see is GDP per capita from 1990 to 2010, and basically here's Russia in green, the Russian Federation, right up there. And down here is Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan. Okay, so good perspective. Here's a picture of net migration from 1960. So this is Russia. Okay, and this is Uzbekistan. And during the 1990s, this was largely ethnic Russians going to Russia. Okay. But we can see, again, here's Uzbekistan has negative net migration. Tajikistan is right here. And Kyrgyzstan is over here, light blue. Okay. So these are net migration. Just put it in a little bit perspective with the other countries. Okay. So I'm drawing on 3 papers. I'm going to start not in the order that we worked on these, but in the order that I think makes some sense here. So we'll talk about a paper we did where we had data on the Central Asian countries of immigration, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. And the basis of this, what I talk about here, the same basis applies to when we were using other data sets from Central Asia. So for this data set, we used a number of surveys from 2013, the job, skills, and migration surveys, the data collected in 2013. It's household and individual level surveys that are representative, and we put them into a single cross section with 6,300 households and 36,000 individuals. Okay, so first a statement on education in Central Asia. Generally, these 3 countries, well, they all inherited a Russian socialist educational system, which guaranteed free basic education. All children are required to attend elementary schools starting at age 6 to 7 and are guaranteed free compulsory education for 9 or 10 years, 12 years in Uzbekistan. After completing their general education at ages 16 to 17, there is choice, a choice of either to enter the labor force or to continue their schooling. And the basically, if you look at this chart on the right of schooling in Tajikistan with the year in school on the left and the age on the right, you see the bottom here in light gray is the compulsory basic education. And that's what we talk about as compulsory education. And all the rest of this is higher education, professional education, of some sort. Okay, this is not compulsory, and this is what people are generally skipping, or maybe skipping. Okay. So our sample, just some brief numbers here. We look at respondents aged 25 to 39 in this subsample. And the idea here is that we want to look at people who were at least 17 or turned 17 after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So after November 9th, 1990, so to speak, or 1991, because we want to distinguish people who had some choice in migration or not. I'm always hesitant on this because we talk about here that migration of the Soviet Union being highly controlled, and I in my deep past did some work with Bob Stewart, where we said, well, it wasn't quite as controlled as the system pretended to be. But anyway, it was certainly more controlled from the outside, so to speak, than inside. But we want people to have more freedom of choice in our survey. So by age 25, people who normally finish whatever professional education they were getting, vocational or tertiary, and have started to work. And the upper limit of 39 means what? That they were 17 in 1991 at the time of our data set. So where people had some choice. So this gives us a sample of 8,037 people, with some 22% of them being current and former migrants. The former migrants are people who've gone and returned within the last 12 months, I believe. Yeah. And 6,000 or so non-migrants. Okay. And Russia's the main destination country. And in this sample, 90% of the current migrants are in Russia, and 8.5% are in Kazakhstan. Okay. Just to outline, this is some comparisons for each country for Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyz, sorry. Kyrgyz migrants, right? Uzbek migrants, Tajik migrants, and by education and by occupation. But if we just look at education, we can see in yellow or mustard gold, the is education in their home country, that is earnings in the last 4 weeks, and blue is the earnings for that level worker in Russia. And we see there's a huge gap, and there's even a huge gap if we compare tertiary with fairly less educated secondary workers, and even less than secondary. And we see this in Tajikistan, in Uzbekistan, as in Kyrgyzstan. So there are these wage differentials out there. Okay. So in this paper, what we do is a series of analysis to try and get at what's going on. We do probit on tertiary education decision, probit on the migration decision, and audit probit of the choice of education, on the choice of education, of how much education. Then we do an IV bivariate probit on the choice of migration and tertiary education, hoping to account for the potential endogeneity of education and migration. And then we do a standard two-stage two-stage exercise where we do have a linear probability model of the choice of migration, and then tertiary education. Okay, so the dark blue is too close to the black to have it stand out. So in the probit, what do we find is after doing the sort of normal controls that we're able to do, country unobserved effects, etc., we find a negative correlation between being an international migrant and the decision to obtain tertiary education. So if you migrate, you're not going to get tertiary education, this type of thing, if you're planning on doing that. When we reverse it and look at a probit on the migration decision, we still find a negative relationship, thankfully, between the decision to migrate and tertiary education. For vocational education, when we ran that separately, it was not significant. Okay. When we did the audit probit, what did we find? We find the hint, the suggestion of an inverted U relationship between the decision to migrate to Russia and educational choice. And of course, this made us extremely happy, jumping for joy, because we all love inverted U relationships. It makes the story more interesting somehow. Basically, the marginal effects of migration on educational choice increases until secondary general education. And then as I move into professional education, both vocational and tertiary, it decreases. So in other words, I'll have a picture of it soon somewhere. Too far ahead. Okay, let me go back then. Basically, if you look at the inverted U, it's in the middle where you have the highest probability of migrating, and as education is either lower or higher, there's a lower probability of migrating. Okay. Oh, and I should have said from the beginning, almost all of this migration is temporary migration, often circular. Okay. People go back home in winter. And I remember years ago when I was reading the description in one of the papers from the East-West Institute describing people returning in the winter, and this was data on Tajikistan. I'm thinking, why would anybody go back to Tajikistan in the winter? And then I realized in my mind, some words were missing. They were leaving Russia in Russia's winter because of the lack of decrease in employment. Okay. In the bivariate probit, we construct an IV, which we construct as the sort of a community's migrant network variable, which we look at the share of current and former migrants relative to the community's population over the age of 47 or 47 and above, okay, to try and capture it relative to people whose decisions were sort of the stock, so to speak. Their decisions on professional education was made on factors other than the ability to migrate. Okay. And surprisingly, it worked. Unlike most IVs that I try, this one worked. And so we find that after controlling for the endogeneity of the decisions about migrating, we find again a negative relationship between migration and tertiary education. Okay, so that relationship I started out talking about seems to be holding up, and I have to say in case I get rushed at the end, it holds up with in all the different data from the different years we used, even using another variant of IV. And it works with the linear probability model as well. So our analysis for the Central Asian countries, these three, shows that these countries all face a loss in human capital formation, at least, although this is cross-section. If they follow up on these results, they say, well, why should I go to school? I'm better off leaving school when I can after mandatory schooling, after mandatory schooling, and trying to migrate. And indeed, in the other papers, and if you look at the casual statistics, at least for a while, it seems to indicate this is what happens. Okay. So what we want to do then is look at a deeper analysis of Tajikistan, the world's, I guess it still has this claim, the world's most remittance-dependent country. Perhaps 47% of 2012 GDP was from remittances. In 2019, it was all the way down to 28%. John, you're shaking your head, and yeah, poverty in 2019, the headcount rate is about 26%. GDP, $8.1 billion, population about 9 million. It's about the size of New Jersey, but much prettier. Okay. GDP growth about 7%. Okay. We use in the initial paper 3 data sets. The first two, 2007 and 2009, are the Living Standards Measurement Survey data that you can download from the World Bank. 2011, it's a Tajikistan's household panel survey. You can download from IOS, that is the Institute for East and Southeast European Studies, located in Regensburg, Germany. And I have to say, I'll probably miss some people, but I give credit here to Barbara Dietz, Gastakova, and Alexander Donzer, who really put together this data and managed to get the names of the people who were in the 2009 and 2007, at least some of those, so that not only do we have 3 repeated cross-section, but we also can construct a panel. Yeah. Okay, and here we look at 3 main probits. Again, we do the continuous explanatory variables on the year of migration and the years of schooling. Looking at those, we also do one where we have binary explanatory variables, that is on whether you got this degree or not. And then we do an IV model as well, in which we're able then to hopefully include adjust for endogeneity. And here our IV variable was the schooling of the household heads. So we took the household head schooling, and we created a sample without the household heads in it, and then we included this variable, and we were able to do our analysis with the schooling of household heads as the IV. Okay, 2007 was very useful because it was the largest data set. Okay, so we could, had more chance to sort of see what was going on in detail there. So here, for the same argument, we use 17 to 27-year-olds. 27-year-olds were 27 in, sorry, it was 17 in 2019. I got to move. So we have our sample. Most of Tajik and Central Asian migration, but certainly Tajik migration, is male, men, 94% of men. And in fact, if you look at the non-migrant sample, then 56% are women. So that's what's going on there. And it's mainly from rural areas. 77% of the Tajik migrants in 2007 are from rural areas compared to 71% of non-migrants in the sample. So it's not that far off, but okay. And again, we get the suggestion of an inverted U. And the next slide should have that. Yes, okay. And so if we skip right to the results of all of our analysis, and I do this because, skip right through, first because of time, and second because this is the GLO discussion paper, and I know, like me, you read every GLO discussion paper that comes out. Yes, okay. It's how we keep up with literature. Or at least the better literature. Okay, so so the results are what? We get this inverted U. Now, you know, like when you look at age earnings profiles, in the U you get, you have to sort of stretch out the to you know, living 200 years because it takes a while for it to fall. Here we get some things that are more obvious, but some that aren't. So if we look at the bottom graph here, this is just on the 2007 data, okay? And what we see is years of schooling on the horizontal and the probability of migrating up on the vertical. And we see that until we get to 11 years of schooling, or 10, 11 years of schooling, the probability of migrating is positive, right? It becomes negative, and this is for men only using the IV, okay? And there it's really quite strong. And then even here, you really see that as they get more and more schooling, the probability of migrating, you know, the marginal effects start to increase again. On the other hand, if we look at everyone, okay, or we look at only men without doing the IV, using other tools, you do also get that hint of early schooling. They go, and then you start to see the turn up at the end here, but it will take a bit while to get there. Okay, but that's the pattern, and that's clear when you look at the tables with the coefficients. So we see something of this inverted U, right? The probability of migrating increases as you the inverted U. So you have the probability of migrating high here in the beginning. Probably as schooling further increases, the probability of migrating falls here, and then, wait a minute. Okay, I'm doing it reverse. I apologize. See, I'm sorry. So anyway, basically, the probability of migrating is increases as schooling increases. It then peaks, and then it declines with still more schooling. So I apologize. As usual, when I give a seminar, I got confused. So what I've been wanting to say is that it's the lower educated and the highest educated who are not migrating, and it's the sort of middle people who finish obligatory mandatory schooling who are migrating. Okay, that's what I want to say. Okay.
Can I just ask a question there at that point? So the story is that people get the education and then use that as a ticket out. Is that the idea?
No, the idea is that unlike, okay, here, this took me a while to wrap my head around years ago. The idea is this, is that there's mandatory education, obligatory education, which brings you through like high school or general high school at some level, lower high school. Okay, and people generally go for that. Okay, and then the decision is made. Do we go for higher education or do we go to work? Okay, and what we're arguing is that with the opportunity to migrate, okay, once they're able to, okay, not that people don't go earlier, okay, but once they're able to, they finish the mandatory schooling and more people are going abroad and doing so over time instead of going on for higher education or working. That's what the essence of the argument is. So this opportunity to migrate has, in a sense, a effect of lowering the human capital level of the country over time, because more people are choosing this high-paying option, which is available to them when they turn 17, 18 years old. That's what the story is. Okay. If we carry it forward with more recent data, and Ilham did this, okay, so credit where it's due, and he used 4 data sets, the same 2007 and 9 living standard measurement unit, the 2013 data that we used in the first paper I talked about, and then he used this this other survey from what was it, the German Institute of some sort of development research, perhaps, a job skills and migration survey, which I think was later. Oh, here it is. I'm sorry. Yeah, the JICA data set. Okay, I apologize. The JICA data set here. So the 3 data sets here, 2007, 2009, 2013, and then the 2018 data. Got it. Okay. It did a multinomial logit to look at the determinants of going to higher schooling or not, tertiary schooling, and it brings in the 2 major crises. So there was a civil war, horrible one, like most, I guess, in the 1990s. So the first period, the 2000 to 2008, was a period of call it post-Civil War recovery, in which there were migration flows due to wage differences, and school enrollments were rising. Then between 2009 and 2013, you look over here, this is in US dollars, this is the wages in Russia, and the wages in Kazakhstan were increasing with oil, right? And over here we have the, 2008 here is the global financial collapse, and over here in 2014 was the Russian financial collapse. Here are wages in Tajikistan, which are slightly increasing, but the gap is being driven by what's happening up here. And so kind of interesting, because you get 3 periods here, and basically what you find is migration, not surprisingly, responds to these changes in the gaps. Okay. So let's see. There's a great table. I had to throw up one table at least like this that we can't read. Okay, so what are the results we find here? We find that the for both men and women in the later period, there's a positive change in continuing professional education. In other words, in this latter period, okay, men and women are staying in school beyond the mandatory ages. They're going back to college, so to speak, or vocational training, tertiary education. So what we would argue then is that our forsaken schooling phenomena is, while it shows up from 2007 to 2013 in Tajikistan, okay, and there's pretty strong evidence for that going on, it doesn't show up afterwards, or it doesn't show up as much afterwards. Now, why doesn't it show up? Well, some of it was the economic downturn in Russia, which also then included stricter Russian migration policy, re-entry bans for migrants who had administrative violations, the use of biometric passports for entry to Russia, a new work permission system, and compulsory tests on the knowledge of Russian language, history, and the Constitution. So these all work to reduce migration. In addition, there was favorable education reform in Tajikistan. It reformed its professional school admission system. It changed what was available to students to study. It reduced the centralized exam process. So generally a whole series of new policies which favored school enrollment and increased the share of people receiving professional education who were not in school and stayed in Tajikistan. And I would argue, although we're sort of waving our hands at this, of course, it's both of these factors. It's the if the large wage differentials, I mean, really large wage differentials, and the restrictive migration policy were not in place, it's not clear how inviting the educational reforms would have been. And then again, without the educational reforms, even with the stricter migration policy, people might have found ways to go to Russia. So these are, I think, complementary factors at work. Okay. So then again, in general, if we look at this forsaken schooling phenomena as it evolved in Tajikistan, we find there are elements of it still there. It increased during the first global financial crisis. It continued in 2013, and then it took a step back. Okay, so the trend stopped, which then tells us what overall, and by overall I mean all three of the studies that that I talked about today, from the initial examination of our sample statistics, which we didn't go through much here, but when you look at them, all of these patterns seem to be clear. And with the estimations, they seem to be clear with the different data sets in the different countries in different times, at least in the 21st century. We find the same story, and it's a story that says, you know, there's something else going on. It's not strictly it's not a brain drain and the brain gain. It's not strictly that. It's, you know, it's not a monotonic set of events. There are different patterns rising depending on the opportunities that people have, okay, to take. Yeah, so the forsaking schooling phenomena, when it occurs, limits the extent to which these countries have been able to turn the youth bulge into their own demographic dividends, and to the extent economic development is driven by skills formation and education. foregone schooling leaves the migrant sending countries with less progress than they might otherwise would have had in building a knowledge-based economy. Okay, but as we see in the end, the story can change. Okay, things can be done about this if your desire is to keep people who are educated by and keep them in to get more educated and stay home. Okay. Oh wait. Thank you. Usually I have this dance around, but I'm an acrobat, so it doesn't.
Okay, thank you very much, Ira. Indeed, it was really fascinating stuff, and especially covered, quite a bit of the papers and therefore different perspectives of it. It was really great stuff. Any questions people want to? There were some chat in the chat. Some of them were answered by Ilham. John, go ahead, please unmute and.
So,
John, just remember, you're giving a talk in a month.
Yes, yes. So what I was just thinking is that like after the fall of communism in the Russian Federation states, their sort of access to higher education would have been sort of fairly tightly controlled with respect to sort of importance or Communist Party membership and all those kinds of things. Isn't that right? So that after the fall, there'd still be sort of a lot of structures in place in which people who had access to higher education would have some sort of connection to the old regime. And so I think there's a structural story going on here at the same time, in the sense that you may not want to, get university education if that university education is still sort of focused on very, Soviet style types of education. And so you're just sort of weighing up your opportunities. You say, okay, I'm this age. Does it make sense for me to get a university education, which is different from maybe what we might say is a university education in the West at the time? And say, no, I think I've just got better chance of making some money if I just migrate and go to Russia. And so you're not telling us really too much about sort of what the labor market situation is. What are they facing? What is it? How do they optimize? How do they make their decisions about that level of education to get, given that there may not be any functioning markets, and so why invest?
Yeah. So okay. So one is the data starting in that we are using started in 2007. So we're 15 years out. Tajikistan's been through a civil war. Many of the now the education structure, from my understanding, didn't change right then. Okay, although in 1990s, people didn't necessarily go to the college they wanted. No, but the point is that what's really driving this, I think, is, in a sense, it doesn't matter. You're getting paid 8 times the wages in Russia that you get as a skilled worker in Tajikistan. And at that wage, I mean, these stories exist in Europe also, right? Eastern Europeans head off, what's the story? Eastern European doctors head off to Britain, not now, but to Britain to work on chicken farms. I mean, these are sort of small individual stories, but taken en masse in a situation, yeah, this is what happens. And there is a great movie which really illustrates this. A great documentary. It's a BBC documentary called Migrant Express, which says more than I could say to give a background for it. But yeah, in a sense, it didn't matter. And you're right, the education wasn't relevant. And in fact, that reform in the teens, 2010s, okay, was in part to reform education, make it more relevant. Okay, give people a schooling that they were interested in, thought that they could use. Okay, I read Ilham's paper on that.
And that had sort of like market value, and the market would value that kind of thing. Yeah.
That was the idea, and that certainly is the idea. Yeah.
Thanks.
Any other questions?
Can I ask a question? In my understanding, when there was a shift or breakout of Central Asia from Russia, their education system was on Russian. That they started to go back, starting with learning their own alphabet. And during that time, there was not much use of high skill, say knowledge. So the stock of knowledge had hardly any use for the younger generation who did not understand Russian. So it took very long time before there was a base to teach advanced knowledge that generation had to the local students. So that was one of the main reasons. The only alternative was for them was basically to immigrate to Russia. And how much this situation, this structural change affected the labor market and migration, and of course, education. Thank you.
Okay, so I just wanted to remind you that we're not strictly talking about university education, right, as the tertiary. We've split it into compulsory and everything above that. So this is really a sort of mixture here, some of which involves technical schools and vocational schools.
But still, this compulsory or technical education should be taught by people who were trained to teach in Russian, not the local language. That could be like a factor that reduces like a utilization of their knowledge.
Okay. I will pass that question on to Ilham if he wants to.
Thank you. That's fine. Thanks.
Is he still around? Yeah. Ilham?
Hello, good morning.
Yes, you're live.
As I understood, the question was about the language which is taught in professional schools, right? Once again.
Yes.
There are still the curriculum in universities and secondary professional education schools were divided in two parts: Russian taught courses, like professional courses which taught in Russian language and in native languages, including Uzbek, Tajik, and Kyrgyz languages. Like there was time when the number of courses taught in Russian languages were shrinking down because of the independence and nationalization, increased nationalism in our countries, and more and more courses were taught in local languages.
Thank you.
Okay. Anything else? Could I just, this is not really a question, this is more of a comment, because I mentioned, I think I had to you a couple of days ago that I did this project for DFID in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. And one thing that struck me, especially about Tajikistan, but Kyrgyzstan as well, but in Tajikistan, one of the, so part of this project was that a couple of us were consultants there who we had to meet these ministers, labor minister, and actually Tajikistan had a migration minister, and there was a development minister. Every minister we met, it seemed like the government's main policy was preparing people to migrate. It was nothing, there were health centers for these young, these people who wanted to migrate, whatever they call it, health center or professional center or preparing center, whatever they were called. But to teach them coach them in terms of how to, entry obviously is free, but how to register, because I think at that time, it was 72 hours to register and stuff. How to go about doing that, and Russian language if they were not, because of primary schooling. So it was the whole development policy was to prepare people to migrate. So, that kind of goes back into kind of other comments that are made, that you're kind of thinking that I don't have anything here in a way. The only thing I have is that the government wants me to migrate and spend a year there, 2 years there, or 10 years there, whatever.
Right. So I think it's a clear trade-off between short-term needs and maybe long-term goals. And maybe you need the remittances because after the Civil War, there's no lack of structure. You need the remittances just to keep going, and it could a story could be told, I think, that okay, that's what happened in the first decade of the century, and then once some level was built up, you could then start again investing in your own schooling and hope to build up human capital to figure out a way to grow without people leaving. I mean, that would be an argument, but it's sort of this trade-off between short-term goals and long-term goals. And, if you're facing a survival constraint, it's the short-term goals that tell you what you're going to do. And that may be migrating. I mean, there's all sorts of other interesting issues here, which I did some work on. Matlub, you've done some, and others have done on the effects of this migration on female labor force participation in Central Asia, on schooling of women in Central Asia, on the whole dynamics that changes over time, right?
So what's going on at the same time with respect to returns to higher education? So those would be really massive signals. If the wage levels of these higher education are starting to rise, then of course people see, oh, okay, yeah, it makes sense to be investing, and it has to be a strong enough signal to make it worthwhile to spend a couple of years in these technical colleges or whatever, for me to take that risk to do that. So there's got to have to be some like big price signals that are changing over time, and then saying, okay, drawing people in and say, look, it makes sense to go for that additional schooling later in, like after 2015 or whatever.
So not that I've done the work that late, okay, on the more recent data, okay, but even earlier, what we found is that the highly educated professionals also are the ones who seem to have a higher informal income. And in fact, the story I tell is I was sitting there and trying to figure out what was happening because it didn't make sense to someone who spent a lot of time studying development. You think of the informal sector as a lower wage, why are professionals? And Ilham had an answer, which seemed to be borne out by when we looked at the data more, which is, initial conditions, so to speak. You're talking about former Soviet economies. So the doctor works in the state hospital all week and sees patients at night and on weekends for cash. Right. Okay, so I would say that that's why when you look at the really high levels of education, even in the first few years that we're looking at, they're not migrating.
Yeah. Right.
And
so they have an outside option.
That's right. And the outside option for, the others is not a bad one in terms of wages, it's migrating. So that's a sort of story, I think.
Okay, I think
before everybody disappears, I just want to say hi to all the names that I see that I haven't seen in a while.
Good stuff.
Nice. Thanks.
Okay.
Great seeing you, Ira.
Good.
You too,
Of
John.
course, yeah. Thank you so much, Ira. Again, really, really interesting talk, and thanks for everybody to participate and to be here with us.